And there were other, deeper wounds. The arrival of the conquistadors brought with it violence toward women's bodies, captivity, coercion, loss. These are not easy truths to face, but they are part of the silence. Behind the shimmering myth of El Dorado lies a shadowed history, and in that shadow, women bore burdens rarely spoken aloud. Yet their silence is not emptiness. It is resilience. It is memory carried forward in song, in textiles, in ritual. Even when their names were never written, their lives shaped the survival of communities. Without them, there would be no story at all. Now imagine another set of women, far across the ocean, Spanish women who remained at home while their husbands, brothers, or sons sailed toward the unknown. What must it have been like to wait in a small Spanish town, hearing tales of golden kingdoms across the sea? For some, perhaps, the legend of El Dorado was a beacon of hope. Riches might return to lift a family out of poverty, to bring dowries, to secure marriages, to earn favor with the crown. For others, it was a source of dread. They knew the odds. Many who left never came back. Picture a young woman, newly married, standing at the harbor as her husband boards a ship. He promises to return, carrying wealth enough for both of them to live comfortably for the rest of their days. She watches until the sails vanish on the horizon. Days pass, then months, then years. Letters never arrive. The silence of absence becomes her companion. Did she resent the dream that stole him? Or did she, too, cling to it, whispering to herself that perhaps he had found El Dorado? Perhaps he would come home tomorrow. The story begins, as many stories do, with a whisper. Not the loud declarations of kings, nor the proclamations carved into stone, but the softer breath of rumor. Along the tangled rivers of South America, where morning mist rises like incense and clings to the green canopy, men and women once passed along a tale. A tale of a place, or perhaps a man, or perhaps an idea, El Dorado, the golden one. In the stillness of dawn, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and flowering vines, a canoe might push quietly into the current. Water laps gently against its wooden sides, and the paddle slices a steady rhythm, pulling the vessel into the unknown. It is here, in the silence between bird calls, that the legend takes root. Imagine voices drifting across the water, traders sharing news, hunters recalling what they had heard from a village deeper in the forest, or perhaps a wanderer claiming to have glimpsed it himself. A ruler so rich that he covered his body in powdered gold, a land so abundant that the rivers gleamed with treasure. The story was not born all at once. Legends rarely are. Instead, it grew like the jungle itself, twisting and weaving through the lives of those who told it. The first Spanish explorers who reached these lands heard fragments of it from the native peoples, and they in turn added their own hopes and dreams to the telling. A glimmer of truth may have lived within it, the ceremonial rites of certain Andean peoples, who dusted their leaders in gold before sacred offerings. But soon the tale outgrew its roots. It became less about ritual and more about desire. Why do humans chase such dreams, even when they know the cost? Perhaps it is because gold has always seemed to hold more than weight. Gold carries a promise. It gleams with permanence, untouched by rust or time. It shines like sunlight captured in stone. To those who had known hunger, danger, or uncertainty, the thought of endless gold meant a chance to step beyond fear. It was not merely wealth, it was a dream of safety, power, and immortality. And yet, as we look back now, the dream feels both luminous and sorrowful. For behind every legend lies the ache of longing. Those who spoke of El Dorado were not simply pointing explorers toward treasure. They were reflecting humanity's restless heart, that eternal desire to find something beyond the ordinary world. As you listen, imagine yourself stepping into a canoe, drifting along a misty river. The water moves slowly, carrying you between walls of dense, shadowed forest. Birds call overhead, their voices piercing the quiet before vanishing into the distance. Somewhere, a monkey stirs, unseen but felt. The air is heavy, almost liquid in its thickness, and each breath fills you with the scent of leaves and life. You are not in a storybook, you are here, alive in this moment. And just ahead, someone whispers of a city where the streets are paved in gold, where a ruler pours treasures into the lake as if they were pebbles. The image burns brightly, impossible to resist. You may even feel it stir something within you, a spark of wonder. Could it be true? And even if it is not, does it matter? For dreams themselves hold a kind of reality, shaping the choices of those who believe. El Dorado was more than a legend. It was a compass, pulling thousands of lives toward its imagined horizon. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, weary from ocean voyages and already heavy with ambition, they too heard the whispers. To them, El Dorado was no longer a distant curiosity, it was destiny. They wrote letters about it, promised rewards for it, sent expeditions deeper and deeper into the jungles. For the people who had lived on these lands long before the Europeans, the legend was both sacred memory and painful distortion. Rituals that once honored the gods were now twisted into tales of endless riches, and soon outsiders flooded their world, chasing gold not as offering but as possession. Still, before we rush ahead into conquest and conflict, let us linger in this beginning. Let us stay with the quiet. The legend begins softly, almost gently. Imagine it told around a fire, the orange light flickering on listening faces. Imagine it sung in a half-remembered chant, carried by the night breeze across villages that rested by the water. The myth did not arrive in the world as a storm, it arrived as a dream. And dreams have their own kind of truth. Perhaps you too have known the pull of a vision, something that seems always out of reach, yet glows with meaning. A new life, a great love, a hidden place where all fears dissolve. Even if we never reach it, the longing shapes us. El Dorado was not only about gold, it was about yearning itself. The jungle holds many secrets. Step into its shade, and you find paths that vanish beneath ferns, streams that sing unseen, stones carved with patterns no one now remembers. The people who lived here understood the sacredness of the land. They knew the rivers as lifelines, the mountains as ancestors, the forests as teachers. Within such a world, a golden ritual made sense, not as greed, but as reverence. Gold was not only wealth, it was sunlight solidified, a fitting gift for the gods. Yet to outsiders, the story was heard differently. To them, it became a map toward riches beyond imagining. And so, rumor became legend. Legend became quest, and quest became history. As you rest here at the edge of the story, with the river carrying us gently forward, I ask you to pause. Why do we, across cultures and centuries, chase dreams that shimmer and fade? Is it because we believe the dream might save us, or because in the pursuit we discover something deeper about ourselves? Perhaps there is no single answer, but the legend of El Dorado continues to speak, not because of the gold, but because it reveals the heart of longing. It is a mirror held up to human hope, reflecting both beauty and folly. And here, at the beginning, before armies march and rivers run red, we have only the soft sound of paddles in water, the hush of leaves above, and a whisper that promises more than the world can give. This is where our golden dream begins. Before we chase after the dream of El Dorado, we must pause. To truly understand the legend, we need to step gently into the lives of the people who were here long before rumors of golden kings drifted across oceans. For the story of gold is not, at its heart, about treasure, it is about meaning. And meaning lives in the hands and hearts of those who first touched the earth, fished the rivers, and lifted their voices to the sky in prayer. Imagine waking not in a palace, nor in a soldier's camp, but in a small village tucked into the folds of the Andes, or beside a curling arm of the Amazon. The day begins not with clocks or bells, but with a slow brightening of the horizon. The air is cool in the mountains, sharper than breath itself, while in the lowlands, the air is heavy, damp, and fragrant with greenery. You rise with others, not alone, for life is lived in circles of family, kin, and community. The women stir first. They tend to the fire, coaxing coals back into flame, warming water for maize porridge or cassava bread. Children sleep bundled in woven cloth, the soft fibers dyed with hues drawn from plants and roots. Soon, the hum of the village awakens, the sound of grinding stones, the laughter of young voices, the barking of a dog who knows the rhythms as well as anyone. Life is not glamorous here, but it is full, tethered to land, sky, and season. To farm is not a simple task, nor is it only survival. It is an act of balance. In the Andes, people carve terraces into mountainsides, transforming slopes into living stairways of green. Potatoes, quinoa, maize, each crop carefully planted, watered, and watched. In the jungle, families cleared small patches of land, cultivating cassava, beans, peppers, and fruit trees while fishing rivers that teemed with life. Women often carried the responsibility of tending these gardens, of knowing which plants to plant beside others, which roots to grind into flour, which herbs could soothe a fever. Their knowledge was memory, handed down like song. And what of weaving? Weaving was not only craft, it was language, art, and story. Women sat with looms strung between poles or anchored to their own bodies, threading bright patterns that spoke of rivers, constellations, animals, and dreams. Each design was a conversation between the weaver and the sky, between the living and the ancestors. To wear such cloth was to be wrapped in meaning, to carry stories against your skin. Have you ever touched something made by hand and felt the warmth of the maker in it, even across time? These woven patterns were just that, bridges of connection, strands that linked generations. To the outside world, gold would one day appear as the most valuable possession. But here, in these villages, a woman's cloth, a mother's song, a farmer's careful tending of terraces, these were the treasures that held life together. Yet gold did exist here, gleaming softly in streams, nestled in mountains. The people of these lands did not hoard it, nor measure their worth by it. Instead, they saw gold as something luminous, closer to the sun than to money. It was a gift from the gods, a reminder of light itself. Gold adorned temples, statues, and ritual objects, not for vanity, but for reverence. A golden cup might be raised not to boast, but to honor the spirits of earth and sky. Masks and ornaments were shaped not to flaunt, but to carry sacred power. Can you imagine the glow of gold not as riches, but as something holy? If this touches you, share what you think about how different cultures see value. Ritual filled the seasons. At planting time, offerings were made, seeds blessed, earth sprinkled with cornmeal or chicha, the fermented drink that carried both cheer and reverence. At harvest, families gathered, celebrating with food, song, and dance, giving thanks to the spirits that made abundance possible. Children watched, learned, and slowly absorbed the rhythm of these ceremonies until they too carried them forward. Women's roles were central, though often unspoken. They wove not only cloth but community. They taught children songs and stories, tended gardens that fed everyone, prepared offerings that kept balance between human and divine. Even in rituals where men stood before the gods, women's labor, the weaving, the food, the preparation, was woven into every gesture. Without them, the rituals would not hold. The world was not easy. Droughts came. Floods washed fields away. Illness struck, sometimes stealing the young, sometimes the old. Yet through it all, the people leaned on one another, finding resilience in shared work and shared belief. When the stars wheeled above at night, villagers looked upward and saw not distant fire, but ancestors. Guiding lights. Some constellations became patterns for weaving, others reminders of when to plant and harvest. The sky was a calendar, a map, a storybook. To live in this world was to live in intimacy with both hardship and beauty. You might spend the day bending your back in the fields, yet in the evening with laughter around a fire, your children safe in your arms, the stars scattering their brilliance above. You might rise in the darkness to pound maize, yet pause at dawn to feel the sun's warmth kiss your face, reminding you of your place in the great circle of life. And so, when we hear of El Dorado, of a golden king, of endless treasure, we must remember this. Before it became a prize for outsiders, gold was already sacred here. It was sunlight made solid, a bridge between worlds, a way to honor the gods who gave breath to the fields and fish to the rivers. To take gold as mere wealth is to strip it of meaning. But to see it as these people saw it, as light, as life, as holiness, is to glimpse the heart of the legend. This was the world before the story was twisted. A world of rhythm and ritual, of women weaving constellations into cloth, of men shaping terraces against mountains, of children running barefoot through fields, learning to laugh, to work, to remember. It was a world not empty, not waiting to be discovered, but alive, breathing, and complete. Let us hold on to this image. A mother bending over her loom, her fingers guiding threads dyed in deep reds and bright yellows. A farmer pressing a seed into soil, whispering a prayer as he covers it with earth. A child watching firelight dance on the surface of a golden ornament, not thinking of riches, but of gods. These are the treasures that lived here long before the legend, the treasures that cannot be carried away by ships or melted into coins. So when El Dorado began to travel as a rumor, as a whisper carried on winds and rivers, it was not only a story of conquest waiting to happen. It was also a reflection, distorted though it became, of a people who had always known the sacred shimmer of gold. And even as the world around them would change, invaded, broken, reshaped, their voices remain. If we listen closely, we may still hear the hum of the loom, the song of the river, the prayer whispered into earth. This is where the legend rests its roots, not in greed, but in reverence, not in conquest, but in connection. And to honor this truth is to remember the people who gave the story its first breath. And so, when we hear of El Dorado, of a golden king, of endless treasure, we must remember this. Before it became a prize for outsiders, gold was already sacred here. It was sunlight made solid, a bridge between worlds, a way to honor the gods who gave breath to the fields and fish to the rivers. To take gold as mere wealth is to strip it of meaning. But to see it as these people saw it, as light, as life, as holiness, is to glimpse the heart of the legend. This was the world before the story was twisted. A world of rhythm and ritual, of women weaving constellations into cloth, of men shaping terraces against mountains, of children running barefoot through fields, learning to laugh, to work, to remember. It was a world not empty, not waiting to be discovered, but alive, breathing, and complete. Let us hold on to this image. A mother bending over her loom, her fingers guiding threads dyed in deep reds and bright yellows. A farmer pressing a seed into soil, whispering a prayer as he covers it with earth. A child watching firelight dance on the surface of a golden ornament, not thinking of riches, but of gods. These are the treasures that lived here long before the legend, the treasures that cannot be carried away by ships or melted into coins. So when El Dorado began to travel as a rumor, as a whisper carried on winds and rivers, it was not only a story of conquest waiting to happen. It was also a reflection, distorted though it became, of a people who had always known the sacred shimmer of gold. And even as the world around them would change, invaded, broken, reshaped, their voices remain. If we listen closely, we may still hear the hum of the loom, the song of the river, the prayer whispered into earth. This is where the legend rests its roots, not in greed, but in reverence, not in conquest, but in connection. And to honor this truth is to remember the people who gave the story its first breath. The ruler, soon to be crowned, spends the night in seclusion. His body is purified with herbs, his spirit steady with prayer. At dawn, he emerges, his skin bare, glistening with sweat from ritual cleansing. And then, slowly, deliberately, attendants press fine gold dust onto his skin. The particles cling, catching every flicker of light, until he gleams as if he himself were the rising sun. Imagine how it must have looked, the human form transformed into living radiance, shimmering not with pride, but with humility before the gods. The people gather at the edge of Lake Guatavita. The waters lie calm, reflecting dawn's first blush. The new leader steps into a raft adorned with offerings, golden ornaments shaped like birds, frogs, and sacred symbols, emeralds, their deep green a reflection of the land itself, bowls of food and drink to nourish the spirits. Priests, draped in woven cloths, chant prayers, their voices carrying across the lake. The drums quicken, then soften, as the raft glides outward across the still surface. At the center of the lake, the moment arrives. The ruler, radiant in gold, stands tall. Then, with slow reverence, he lowers himself into the water. The lake closes around him, cool and dark, carrying away the dust of gold. Each particle disperses like sunlight breaking into 1,000 stars beneath the surface. Around him, attendants cast the offerings into the depths. Gold glints briefly, then vanishes into the lake's embrace, not lost, but given, returned to the gods as thanks, as promise, as devotion. Can you see it? Firelight and starlight reflecting on rippling water, the sound of drums fading into stillness, the breath of a people held in awe. It was not greed. It was gratitude. Not accumulation, but surrender. Gold here was never meant to be piled in vaults or hoarded in treasure chests. It was light made tangible, a bridge between human beings and the divine order of the cosmos. Stories like this remind us, have you ever known of something beautiful that outsiders misunderstood? For the Muisca, this ritual reaffirmed the sacred relationship between ruler and people, people and gods, gods and earth. The lake became the witness, the keeper of vows. Each new leader who underwent this shimmering baptism entered not as a king of wealth, but as a servant of balance. To govern was to honor, and to honor was to give back. But how fragile is beauty when seen through foreign eyes? When whispers of this ceremony reached ears beyond the mountains, first among neighboring peoples, then eventually among European explorers, the meaning shifted. What was sacred became distorted. Imagine a story traveling downriver, told by traders, sung by wanderers, reshaped with each retelling. The golden man became El Dorado, the gilded one. Soon, he was no longer a man at all, but a legend of inexhaustible wealth. A lake full of offerings transformed into rumors of bottomless treasure. A ritual of humility became a promise of riches beyond imagination. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to see why. Those who had never lived in these mountains, who did not know the songs of the Muisca or the prayers spoken to the lake, saw only what their eyes hungered for: gold. To them, it was currency, conquest, crowns, and power. But in this moment, standing at the edge of Guatavita, you can feel the difference. To one people, gold was holy light. To another, it became the fuel of empire. And so El Dorado was born, not in a palace, not in a hidden city, but in a ceremony beneath the stars, on the surface of a quiet lake. Born in devotion, reshaped in misunderstanding. What the Muisca gave freely to the gods was recast as a secret hoard waiting to be seized. And from that seed of misinterpretation, centuries of searching, conquest, and sorrow would grow. But before we follow that darker path, let us linger here. Let us hold the image steady. A lake at dawn, its waters calm and gleaming. A man covered in gold dust, shining like the sun, slipping beneath the surface as an offering. Treasures falling gently into the depths, not stolen, but given. Drums fading into silence, voices lifting in reverence, and stars above bearing witness to it all. This was the birth of El Dorado, not a city, but a prayer. Not a fortune, but a light. The dawn that broke across the Caribbean in the early 1500s was unlike any other. For centuries, the people of the Andes, the forests, and the great river valleys of South America had lived in rhythms set by the land, by planting, by fishing, by weaving, by song. Now, sails appeared on the horizon. Tall, pale strangers came ashore, bearing crosses, muskets, and a hunger that seemed endless. What followed was not merely an encounter, but a collision of worlds, one rooted in reverence for balance and the other in the restless pursuit of conquest. The first Spaniards to arrive in these lands came fresh from victories across the Caribbean islands, hardened by battles and driven by dreams of wealth. In Europe, they had heard tales of lands brimming with riches, tales that grew with every voyage, each one carrying back whispers of gold so abundant it could dazzle the eyes. By the time they set foot on South American soil, the conquistadors were already searching not for people to know, but for treasure to claim. Imagine the strangeness of that moment. Men clad in steel, sweating in the fierce heat of the tropics, faces burned by sun and salt, stepping into villages where people lived in houses of earth and reed, surrounded by woven textiles bright as parrots and carved ornaments shaped by generations of skilled hands. The Spaniards marveled, but they also measured. Every sight was weighed against their singular desire: gold. For the indigenous peoples, the arrival was bewildering. Who were these men who spoke in tongues no one understood, who carried weapons that thundered with smoke, who demanded tribute before trust? At first, some communities greeted them with curiosity or caution, offering food and water as they would to travelers. Others resisted, fearful of the strangers' intentions. Across the continent, word spread like fire on the wind. Pale men had come from the sea, and they sought gold with an intensity that unsettled even the elders who had seen much in their lifetimes. The Spaniards carried rumors with them as much as swords. Around campfires and on long marches, they spoke of a place where gold was not hidden in streams or crafted into ornaments, but overflowed in rivers, hung heavy from temples, and lay waiting to be claimed. Some said it was a city, others a kingdom, others still a man, a king who covered himself in gold dust. The legend of El Dorado began to weave itself into their thoughts, mingling truth and misunderstanding until it hardened into conviction. And so, each encounter with indigenous people was shaped by this hunger. Where is the gold? They would ask, over and over, gesture sharp eyes searching. To those who tried to explain the sacred rituals of Lake Guadavita, their words were twisted, reshaped into promises of treasure buried in the earth. What had been devotion was translated into wealth. What had been offering was reimagined as possession. But pause for a moment and consider the other side. The Muisca, the Inca, the countless communities scattered across valleys and forests. How did they feel as strangers pressed them for answers to questions that had no meaning in their world? How would you feel if someone came into your home, not seeking friendship or exchange, but demanding to know where you hid your wealth? As you hear this, imagine what it would feel like to have strangers arrive in your homeland, searching not for friendship, but for treasure. What would you feel? For the conquistadors, gold was more than glittering metal. It was the fuel of empire, the key to status back in Spain, the proof of divine favor in a world where wealth was seen as evidence of God's blessing. Many were younger sons of impoverished families, men who had little inheritance awaiting them in Europe. For them, the New World was a gamble, a chance to gain in months what might take lifetimes in their homeland. They were desperate, reckless, and willing to risk everything. For the indigenous peoples, gold had always been something different. To the Muisca, it was sacred light. To the Inca, it was the sweat of the sun. To others, it was a medium for art, a vessel for prayer, a way of honoring ancestors. It was not counted, weighed, or hoarded. Its worth lay in what it represented, not in how much could be held in one's hand. This difference in meaning created a gulf wider than any ocean. Spaniards saw offerings at shrines and lakes and imagined hoards yet undiscovered. They saw ornaments on women, masks and ceremonies, and thought only of how much coin could be melted from them. They saw lakes and rivers, and in every reflection of sunlight, they saw gold waiting for their grasp. And so, rumors of El Dorado spread further still. Conquistadors, who had once fought under Cortez in Mexico or Pizarro in Peru, carried with them stories of mountains of treasure, retold with each retelling until the details blurred into myth. Some spoke of a city paved with gold, others of a king who bathed in it daily, still others of whole valleys where the earth itself glittered. The whispers grew louder, fueled by both fear and hope, until no one could tell where truth ended and dream began. The people of the land watched as their world shifted. Communities were broken apart, leaders captured, temples stripped. Some resisted, others fled, still others sought to bargain, offering gifts in hopes of peace. But peace rarely lasted. For every bowl of food offered in welcome, a Spaniard asked, "Where is the gold?" For every gesture of friendship, there was suspicion. For every sacred place described, there was a demand to see it, to touch it, to take from it. The forests and mountains of South America had always held mystery. Now, that mystery was reframed through foreign eyes. The same mist rising over rivers that once inspired songs of spirits became, to conquistadors, a veil concealing treasure. The same lakes where offerings shimmered became, in their minds, vaults waiting to be emptied. The land itself became a map of promises, drawn not by those who lived there, but by those who hungered for it. And yet, the Spaniards were not only villains in their own eyes. Many believed they were fulfilling a divine mission, bringing faith, order, and civilization to lands they barely understood. Some felt awe at the beauty they encountered, at the skill of artisans, at the dignity of rulers. But all gave way to ambition, and ambition to violence. The dream of gold outweighed the possibility of mutual respect. So the whispers grew, louder and louder, echoing across jungles, mountains, and seas. El Dorado was no longer just a ceremony at Lake Guadavita, no longer just a sacred act of devotion. It had become a mirage pursued by men who would give everything to reach it. For the indigenous peoples, this pursuit brought upheaval, suffering, and loss. For the conquistadors, it promised glory, but often delivered despair. In the end, both sides were caught in a story larger than themselves, one born of misunderstanding, reshaped by desire, and destined to echo through centuries. And it all began with whispers across the ocean, whispers that carried dreams and turned them into a legend. The legend of El Dorado did not remain a whisper. With each retelling, it swelled into a vision so grand, so dazzling, that men were willing to risk their lives to find it. To many conquistadors, El Dorado was no longer a story, it was a promise. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of South America, they believed, lay riches beyond imagination, a city gleaming with golden temples, a kingdom overflowing with jewels, a ruler bathed in shimmering dust. And so began the long, painful chapter of endless expeditions, journeys that tested the limits of human endurance and revealed how far dreams can drive us, toward both courage and cruelty. The first major quest that captured this obsession came in the 1540s, when Gonzalo Pizarro, the half-brother of Francisco Pizarro, marched eastward from Quito. At his side was a man who would become both rival and legend in his own right, Francisco de Orellana. Their goal was simple in words, impossible in practice: to pierce the spine of the Andes, cross the unknown lands beyond, and uncover the fabled riches that whispers promised lay hidden there. Pizarro led nearly 4,000 men, horses, and slaves into the highlands, laden with supplies, dogs, and weapons. The mood was one of determination, even confidence. Surely with so many men, and with the authority of the Pizarro name, they could not fail. But as they descended into the jungles, the land itself rose up to resist them. The Andean slopes turned to dense forests where every step tangled in vines, where rain poured without end, where insects swarmed so thickly that men scratched their skin raw. Food ran scarce. Supplies rotted. Horses died, one by one, their great frames collapsing in the mud. Even the war dogs, symbols of Spanish might, fell silent in exhaustion. The men grew desperate. Hunger gnawed at their bellies until they chewed on leather straps and boiled tree bark. Disease spread in the damp heat, fevers burned, stomachs churned, and once strong soldiers wasted away to shadows. The grand company that had begun in triumph dwindled, each mile claiming more lives. It was in this crucible of suffering that Francisco de Orellana made his fateful choice. Tasked with scouting the river in search of food, he and a small band set off in boats, intending to return. But the current carried them farther, and the jungle closed behind them. With no way back and no supplies to share, Orellana decided to continue forward. His journey would lead him, almost by accident, to become the first European to navigate the length of the Amazon River. Imagine the astonishment of those men as they drifted on a river wider than any they had seen, cutting through a wilderness that seemed endless. They encountered communities along its banks, some hostile, some curious. One battle with fierce women warriors even gave rise to the river's name, the Amazon. By the time Orellana reached the Atlantic, months later, he had written himself into history, though his betrayal left Pizarro's men starving in the jungle, abandoned to their misery. This was the pattern that would repeat itself. Bold beginnings, harsh realities, desperate choices, and stories that only made the legend grow. Each failed expedition did not kill the dream of El Dorado. It fed it. The harder it proved to find, the more certain people became that it must be out there, just beyond the horizon. In the decades that followed, others took up the quest. Pedro de Ursua led one of the most infamous expeditions, which quickly dissolved into mutiny under Lope de Aguirre, a man whose name still echoes with madness. Aguirre, once a loyal conquistador, turned on his commander, declaring himself the wrath of God and leading his men on a reign of terror through the jungle. His obsession with finding El Dorado consumed him until he betrayed allies, murdered companions, and raged against Spain itself. The jungle did not yield gold to Aguirre, only a mirror reflecting his descent into cruelty. Other names: Hernan Perez de Quesada, Antonio de Berrio, countless captains, each added their own chapter. They marched armies into valleys where no maps guided them. They cut paths through forests so thick the sunlight never touched the ground. They crossed rivers that seemed to flow without end, drinking muddy water, gnawing on scraps, driven by the same dream that had carried those before them. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of men left Spain and never returned. Horses, pigs, and dogs were carried into lands where they could not survive. Indigenous guides, often forced or coerced, bore the heaviest burdens, carrying supplies, navigating rivers, and often dying nameless in service to a dream that was not their own. Communities along the way were disrupted, sometimes destroyed. As expeditions took food, demanded tribute, or unleashed violence when their demands were unmet. And yet, in the quiet of night, as men lay exhausted under dripping leaves, it was not despair alone that filled them. Some still believed, truly believed, that just beyond tomorrow's march lay the glittering city. Perhaps it was over the next ridge. Perhaps behind the next bend in the river. The suffering only seemed to prove the treasure's worth. After all, they reasoned, why would such riches be easy to find? Was not the struggle itself a sign of destiny? Here we see how human longing works. A dream can inspire courage, yes, the courage to face hunger, to press on despite despair, to cross rivers no European had crossed before. But the same longing can twist into cruelty. It can justify the suffering of others. It can make a man blind to the beauty of the land around him, blind even to his own humanity, because his eyes see only the shining vision that dances always just out of reach. By the late 1500s, El Dorado was no longer just a golden king at Lake Guadavita. It had become a shifting mirage, moving further each time someone claimed to know its location. Some said it was in the Amazon basin, others swore it was in Guyana, still others placed it in the mountains of Venezuela. Each failure only widened the legend's reach, and as the century turned, the obsession spread beyond Spain. Sir Walter Raleigh, the English courtier and explorer, took up the quest himself, sailing to South America with hopes of bringing glory not only to himself but to Queen Elizabeth. He returned with grand tales of golden cities waiting inland, tales that inspired poets, investors, and future expeditions. Though Raleigh found nothing, his words ensured that El Dorado lived on, not only in Spain, but across Europe. The legend had become larger than life, impossible to kill. It had become a dream that outlived the dreamers. So, as we reflect on these journeys, it is worth asking gently, what do we see in them? Courage. Yes, the bravery to step into the unknown, to endure hardships that most of us can hardly imagine. But cruelty, too, the willingness to impose suffering, to take from others, to pursue a dream no matter the cost. And perhaps, within all of us, lies a piece of this paradox. We all chase dreams, sometimes noble, sometimes foolish. Sometimes the chase itself gives meaning. Other times, it blinds us to what is already around us. These journeys ask us, what dreams are worth chasing, and what dreams only harm us? Share your thoughts if you'd like. When we speak of El Dorado, the names that echo are almost always men's. Conquistadors, captains, kings, explorers. They march across the pages of history in shining armor, carrying banners, wielding swords, chasing after treasure. But behind these grand myths lie silences, voices never recorded, faces never named, lives changed forever. Among those silences are the voices of women. Tonight, let us listen gently for them, even if only in imagination. Think first of the indigenous women of the Andes, of the forests, of the river valleys. When the rumors of El Dorado drew strangers deeper into their homelands, it was women who felt the tremors in daily life first. Picture a woman weaving by the fire, her children playing beside her. News travels quickly. Men have come with strange animals, with shining weapons, with demands no one fully understands. Her world, once marked by the rhythm of planting and harvest, weaving and ritual, is unsettled. What does she feel? Fear, perhaps, or anger, or quiet determination to protect what can still be protected. For some, the intrusion was violent and immediate. Homes burned, food seized, husbands and fathers conscripted as guides or porters. For others, the change was slower but no less profound. Trading patterns disrupted, fields left untended, rivers guarded, ceremonies interrupted. And through it all, women kept the thread of daily life alive. They fed children when food was scarce. They whispered stories into the ears of the young so memory would not vanish. They continued to weave, perhaps with new patterns, even as their hands shook with uncertainty. Some women did travel to the New World. A few accompanied expeditions, often as servants, companions, or, in rare cases, settlers seeking new lives. Their journeys are even less recorded, their voices even fainter. What did they see in the jungles? What did they think of the endless marching, the hunger, the despair? Perhaps, like the men, they dreamed of gold. Or perhaps they simply dreamed of safety, of rest, of a home where the ground did not tremble beneath so many footsteps. The silence of women's voices in the El Dorado legend also speaks to how myths are shaped. Legends are often told through power, by those who conquer, command, or record. Women's roles, feeding, weaving, bearing children, tending rituals, were less likely to be inscribed in official accounts. But these roles are no less vital. To pause and listen for them is to shift the story's shape. Imagine the legend of El Dorado retold not as a tale of gold and conquest, but as a tale of survival. Of mothers passing on songs so children would remember who they were. Of weavers stitching symbols into cloth so that even if words failed, patterns would speak. Of women at riverbanks washing clothes, watching the ripples, whispering prayers that strangers would not come that way. This, too, is El Dorado, not a city of gold, but a story of endurance. There is also something tender in thinking of women who found beauty where others saw only wealth. Gold, for the Muisca and other peoples, was not currency. It was sacred, a bridge to the divine. Perhaps women, tending offerings, polishing ornaments, preparing ceremonies, felt that holiness most intimately. They may have seen outsiders misunderstand it, grasping for riches without ever seeing the spirit within. What must it have been like to watch the sacred become plunder in another's hands? And what of us, centuries later? We inherit these silences. The chronicles of men dominate the archives, but the lives of women remain in shadows. Yet if we lean closer, we can hear them, in the lullabies that survived, in the patterns of cloth preserved in museums, in oral traditions still carried today. Listening for those voices does not erase the grand myths, but it softens them. It reminds us that history is never just the march of armies or the search for treasure. It is also the quiet persistence of those who keep life going amid upheaval. Sometimes history forgets voices. Sometimes legends silence them entirely. But if we pause, if we listen gently, we can begin to imagine them back into the story. And when we do, the legend of El Dorado changes. It becomes less a tale of gold and more a meditation on what endures when all else falls away. So tonight, as you rest, perhaps you can carry this thought with you. Every story has silences, and in those silences live the voices of women, of mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, who shaped history not by conquest, but by continuity. They remind us that even in the shadow of great myths, life continues. Psalms are sung, children are held, fires are tended. And that, too, is worth remembering. Sometimes history forgets voices. If you could hear from one missing voice in this story, who would it be? Long before airplanes or satellites, before photographs or even reliable surveys, much of the world was known to most Europeans only through stories. And stories, as we know, have a way of growing. El Dorado, this shining land of unimaginable wealth, became one of the most compelling stories of all. It slipped across oceans like a whisper, lodging itself in the minds of those who long for adventure, or for profit, or perhaps just for a taste of wonder. Picture Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Markets hum with the chatter of merchants, streets echo with the clip of hooves on stone, and taverns glow with firelight as sailors and travelers tell tales of faraway places. Into these settings, rumors of El Dorado were poured like rich wine. Some said it was a golden city hidden deep in the jungles. Others claimed it was a lake whose waters sparkled with offerings of treasure. Still others spoke of a kingdom where every roof was gilded, every street paved with shining metal. Each retelling reshaped the dream. Mapmakers, listening to these tales, faced a curious task. They did not have proof of El Dorado's existence, yet the pressure to record what was rumored was immense. And so, slowly, El Dorado began to appear on maps, not as a fixed and certain place, but as a possibility, a shadow of longing traced onto parchment. Sometimes it was drawn high in the Andes, sometimes deep in the Amazon basin, sometimes near vast lakes that stretched like mirrors of the sky. Each new map moved the Golden Kingdom like a mirage, always just beyond reach. Imagine yourself holding one of those maps, freshly inked, the smell of parchment still lingering. You trace your finger across the lines, the coastlines carefully drawn, the rivers winding, the mountains rising in delicate strokes. And there, somewhere in the heart of South America, a name appears, El Dorado, perhaps accompanied by a small crown, or the drawing of a city, or simply a note that said, "Here lies the land of gold." Would you not feel a pull in your chest, a curiosity that perhaps, if you were brave enough, you might one day find it? That was the power of maps in that era. They were not only guides to geography, they were invitations to dream. For many in Europe, these maps were the first visual proof that such a place could exist. Even if no one had seen it, to see it marked was to believe. Poets and writers joined the chorus. El Dorado slipped into songs and verses, sometimes as a promise of paradise, sometimes as a cautionary tale. In England, Spain, Portugal, France, the legend stirred imaginations. Think of the lonely sailor staring at the stars, humming a verse about golden lands. Think of the ambitious courtier whispering into a nobleman's ear that sponsoring an expedition might yield treasures untold. The myth became not only a tale of geography, but of possibility, shaping hopes and decisions across a continent. The fascination with El Dorado was not only about gold. It was also about wonder. Europe was in the throes of discovery, expansion, and upheaval. The world seemed to be unfolding at a dizzying pace. New foods, plants, animals, and cultures were flooding into ports and palaces. It was an age of marvels, and amid the tide, El Dorado was the brightest jewel of all. A land untouched, a kingdom beyond imagination, waiting to be found. Tonight, as you drift with this story, think of how many maps you've seen in your life. Each one, in its way, tells you not just where things are, but what people believed about those places when the map was made. El Dorado, written in careful ink across the heart of South America, was less a place than a longing captured on parchment. It tells us as much about Europe's hunger for wonder, wealth, and power as it does about the lands themselves. And so, El Dorado grew, not in the soil of the Andes or the waters of the Amazon, but in the minds of mapmakers and dreamers. It was a place of ink and imagination, carried across oceans, pinned to the walls of studies and palaces, tucked into sailors' chests. Even as no one found it, it was found again and again in stories, in drawings, in dreams. Imagine holding such a map with a place marked that no one has ever seen. Would you want to go? Every story has a beginning, and every story has an end, or at least, a kind of soft unwinding. The legend of El Dorado, once blazing like a beacon of hope and hunger across Europe, did not vanish with a sudden extinguishing. Instead, it faded slowly, like the last glow of firelight as dawn breaks, leaving behind embers, whispers, and shadows. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the dream of a golden kingdom began to lose its hold. Not because the longing for wealth or wonder disappeared, but because the weight of failure grew too heavy to ignore. Imagine the explorers who once marched through jungles, their boots sinking into mud, their eyes straining at every glimmer of sunlight through leaves, hoping it might be a roof of gold. Their maps had grown cluttered with guesses, their journals filled with promises that each river, each valley, each mountain ridge might finally lead to El Dorado. But with each return, their tales changed. They brought back fewer triumphs and more scars. They brought back silence where once there had been boastful declarations. In Spain, in England, in Portugal, whispers turned into sighs. The costs of these journeys were staggering. Ships lost at sea, men claimed by fever, fortunes poured into expeditions that returned with nothing but weary survivors. The stories of glittering kingdoms dimmed. Skepticism crept in like ivy across the stones of old castles. Even the most daring adventurers began to question whether El Dorado had ever been real. And yet, there is a strange truth about myths. Even when belief falters, they seldom vanish. Instead, they shift into another form, becoming allegories, becoming lessons, becoming part of a culture's imagination. Picture now the landscapes where these quests once unfolded. The thick jungles of the Amazon, the misty ridges of the Andes, the hidden lakes reflecting nothing but the sky. Many expeditions had passed, their torches and boots disturbing the earth. Yet slowly, steadily, the land reclaimed itself. Vines wound their way over abandoned camps. Forests swallowed paths cut by desperate men. The rivers ran on, washing away the traces of canoes and rafts. What human hands had tried to carve, nature's patience quietly erased. There is something soothing in that image, isn't there? The thought that the earth endures, that it absorbs both wounds and wonders, and then continues, green and full. As though whispering that all human striving is but a moment in its longer story. And within those forests and mountains, indigenous cultures remained. Their villages shifted, their ways of life adapted, their voices endured even when drowned out by conquest and colonization. Though much was lost, much was also carried forward: songs, rituals, the memory of sacred lakes, the understanding that gold was never merely a treasure, but a thread between the living and the divine. To them, the fading of El Dorado may not have felt like the ending of a golden world, but rather the continuation of one. A world where wealth was measured not in what one could take, but in what one could give. Where the lake still shimmered under the moon, and where stories remained as offerings more lasting than metal. For Europeans, however, the fading of the myth marked a change in spirit. The age of El Dorado gave way to other obsessions: trade routes, colonies, the pursuit of spices, sugar, silver. Gold was no longer imagined as a hidden kingdom waiting to be unveiled, but as veins within mountains to be mined, as coins to be struck, as currency to be hoarded. The dream had shifted from the poetic to the practical, from the luminous to the cold. Still, the image lingered. Poets continued to write of El Dorado, not as a place to be found, but as a metaphor. The Golden Land became a symbol of unreachable desire, of human longing for something more than life can grant. In this way, even as expeditions dwindled, the legend survived in ink and imagination. It became less geography and more philosophy. Can you see how myths transform? They begin in ceremony, as with the Muisca and their sacred lake. They grow into rumor, into obsession, into maps and expeditions. And then, when disproven, they soften into metaphor, carried not in footsteps, but in words. Even in fading, they endure. Picture, if you will, a lone traveler centuries later, walking along the shores of Lake Guadavita. The jungle hums with insects, the water ripples in the breeze, and the crater walls rise around in quiet majesty. To stand there is to feel both presence and absence, the presence of memory and the absence of proof. Somewhere beneath those waters, perhaps, lie remnants of the offerings once given, small figures of gold, emeralds dulled by time, treasures untouched. Yet their value is no longer in their glitter, but in the story they hold. And so El Dorado lingers, not as a city, not as a kingdom, but as a reminder of how humans dream. The fading of the golden world was not its death, but its transformation. It became a lesson in longing, a mirror of desire, a caution against obsession, and yet also a celebration of imagination. As this golden dream fades, I wonder, do you think myths ever truly die, or do they live inside us? Even when a story fades, it rarely disappears completely. The legend of El Dorado, once a flame of obsession for conquistadors and kings, still lingers with us, centuries later. It has become softer now, less about the glitter of gold and more about the shimmer of longing that lives inside the human spirit. We carry El Dorado not on our maps, but in our words, in our art, and in the quiet corners of our imaginations. Think about how often you've heard the name. Perhaps in passing, on a street sign, the name of a hotel, a town, or a song playing softly in the background. El Dorado lives on not as a place of rivers and forests, but as an idea, a symbol of something just out of reach. It has slipped free from geography and become part of our shared language, a way of speaking about the unreachable dream. In literature, the echoes are strong. The poet Edgar Allan Poe wrote of a weary knight searching endlessly for El Dorado, his armor gleaming, his steps heavy, his quest unfinished. For Poe, the Golden Land was not a city in Colombia or Peru, but the ultimate symbol of desire, something we pursue across a lifetime, perhaps never defined. Writers since then have followed this path, using El Dorado as shorthand for obsession, for ambition, for the shimmering horizon that always recedes as we walk toward it. In music, too, the name has lived many lives. From folk ballads to rock albums, from quiet guitar strings to orchestras, artists have used El Dorado as a title, a theme, a metaphor. Sometimes it means wealth, sometimes love, sometimes a dream too bright to be touched. Each version says less about the real ceremonies of the Muisca, and more about the longings of the singer, the listener, the world around them. Even in cinema, the legend appears. Hollywood has taken the name more than once. A Western film starring John Wayne in the 1960s, an animated adventure at the turn of the millennium, documentaries tracing the historical myth. In each, the El Dorado presented is different, sometimes a physical place of gold and glory, sometimes a moral lesson about greed, sometimes a playful fable for children. That adaptability is part of its survival. Myths endure not because they stay fixed, but because they change shape to match the dreams of those who tell them. And then, of course, there are the places. Drive through certain towns in North or South America, and you may pass through a place called El Dorado. There are El Dorado counties, El Dorado streets, El Dorado nightclubs glowing with neon signs. In each case, the name promises something just a little more special, a little brighter, a little richer than the ordinary. It is a promise of possibility, even if the reality is simply a roadside diner, a small community, or a gathering place for music and dance. The name is powerful, not for what it contains, but for what it suggests. Do you notice how El Dorado has shifted over time? At first, it was a sacred ceremony by the waters of Lake Guatavita. Then, it became a rumor of endless riches, whispered into European ears and magnified into obsession. Later, it softened into poetry, into metaphor. Now, it is a word we use for any unreachable desire, any dream shining just beyond our grasp. From the jungles of Colombia to the pages of books, from maps of explorers to the lyrics of songs, El Dorado has become both everywhere and nowhere. Perhaps that is the truest form of immortality, not to be found in one place, but to live scattered across imagination, language, and longing. And if we pause for a moment, we might realize that El Dorado is not really about gold at all. It is about the way humans dream. We are creatures who look beyond what we have, who stretch our eyes toward horizons, who imagine what lies just out of sight. Sometimes that dreaming has led us to cruelty, to conquest, to harm. But other times, it has given us art, music, poetry, and stories that comfort us in the night. Do you have your own El Dorado? A hope, a vision, a shining goal you walk toward even if you may never reach it? Perhaps it is not made of gold dust and emeralds, but of something quieter, peace, love, meaning, belonging. Perhaps it glimmers not in jungles across the ocean, but in your own heart, waiting for the courage to chase it. The echo of El Dorado in modern times reminds us that myths are not only about the past. They are about the present and the future too. They hold a mirror up to us, showing what we fear, what we desire, what we are willing to risk for something we believe in. To speak of El Dorado now is to speak of that universal pull towards something greater. And so, even as the golden world of the conquistadors has faded, the golden dream remains. It lingers in a song lyric, in a line of poetry, in the name of a town you pass without thinking. It lingers in the longing you carry inside yourself, for something beautiful, something perhaps impossible, but something that makes life shimmer with possibility. As you drift into rest, let the thought settle gently. El Dorado was never truly a place. It was, and is, a story. And like all stories, it belongs not just to history, but to you, here and now. Do you have your own El Dorado? A dream shining just beyond your grasp? The river is quiet now. Its waters, once glittering with the promise of golden cities and untold wealth, move slowly beneath the fading light of dusk. The mist that clings to its banks has grown heavier, touched by the coolness of nightfall. Above, the last traces of sun surrender to the stars, and the jungle seems to exhale, as if it too is ready for rest. We began with a dream, an image of a man covered in gold dust, shimmering in the first rays of dawn, offering his treasures to the gods of the water. That image sparked centuries of longing, of searching, of struggle and loss. It drew explorers across oceans and into forests where they could not survive, reshaping maps, reshaping lives. And yet, after all the journeys, all the rumors, all the battles, El Dorado was never found. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the meaning was never in the treasure itself, but in the story. The story survived where the expeditions failed. It glimmers still, not in rivers of gold, but in the shared memory of people who speak its name. That is the gift myths offer us, not proof, not possession, but companionship. They walk beside us as we live, reminding us of what it means to long, to hope, to dream. As I tell you this now, I imagine us both returning to that quiet riverbank, listening to the slow ripple of water against the canoe. The jungle hums softly, crickets and frogs carrying their nocturnal songs into the air. The horizon is dark, yet the first stars have already kindled their tiny flames. Gold has faded into silver, into starlight, into a gentler kind of glow. In that fading light, the lesson of El Dorado feels clear. We search for treasure, for wealth, for glory, and yet, often what remains is not what we sought, but what we carried in our hearts. The conquistadors never found their golden city, but we have inherited their tale. And in telling it, we transform it from a history of conquest and loss into a meditation on longing and meaning. Isn't it true in our own lives as well? We dream of distant shores, shining goals, unreachable heights. We walk toward them, perhaps never arriving. And yet, along the way, we gather stories, friendships, memories, small sacred moments that become the true treasure. El Dorado teaches us this. Sometimes what we seek is not meant to be owned, but to guide us, to remind us of the shimmer of possibility that keeps us moving forward. Close your eyes for a moment, if you wish, and imagine that you, too, are drifting on that river. The water carries you gently, your body at ease, the sky unfolding above you. The moon climbs slowly, her reflection bending and shimmering in the ripples. You feel no need to hurry. No gold waits ahead, only the gift of stillness, of drifting, of being held by the current. This is how stories rest with us. Not as burdens, not as quests, but as companions in the quiet. Just as the stars accompany the night, the legend of El Dorado accompanies our dreaming. It has traveled centuries to reach you here tonight, ready to sit by your side as you drift into sleep. Think of the people who first told this story, in voices low and reverent, as the night gathered around them. Think of the women weaving patterns that echoed the constellations, the farmers lifting their eyes from the earth to watch the shimmer of firelight on gold. Think of the mapmakers sketching rivers they had never seen, their quills trembling with imagination. Think of the poets and singers, the filmmakers and storytellers, each reshaping El Dorado in their own way, passing the lantern forward from hand to hand. And now, at last, that lantern rests with you. The glow may be faint, but it is enough. Enough to warm you as you drift, enough to remind you that myths never truly end. They live inside us, as long as we remember them, as long as we speak their names. El Dorado may never have been found in the jungles of South America, but it exists here, in this moment of quiet reflection, in the soft beat of your heart, in the gentle rhythm of breath as you prepare to rest. And so, as this golden dream comes to its close, I invite you to let go of the chase, of the searching, of the reaching. You do not need to find El Dorado tonight. You only need to feel its echo, its softness, its promise. Let it guide you not to distant lands, but into the safe, restorative landscape of your own dreams. The river drifts on. The stars gather above. The jungle hushes, quieter now, as though the world itself is ready for sleep. And you too are ready. Ready to close your eyes, to rest, to carry with you the story not as a burden, but as a gentle companion through the night. As you drift into dreams, I hope this golden story keeps you company. If you'd like more calming journeys like this, remember to subscribe and return whenever you need another lantern in the night. Sleep well, dear traveler. May your own El Dorado, whatever it may be, shine gently in your heart as you rest.